I don't know how many of you know about something that's been happening, but we in the office have appreciated Dory Johnson's help. She's been coming in 2 days a week and helping Louise in the office as a gift of service. And Louise has definitely appreciated it, as have the rest of the staff members. One morning I walked out of my study and I said, "Here, Louise, don't laugh when you see this title. It's Baldy and the Two Bears." And Dory said right away, "I want to hear that one. I was just thinking about that story. Why in the world is that story there?" You know something? I've never preached on this text before. Turn to 2 Kings, chapter 2. 26 years of preaching, and I have never touched on this text before. So this morning, we're going to look at Baldy and the Two Bears. It's a strange story. It comes very early in the ministry of Elisha. It's just right after his first miracle is performed. And it's caused a lot of problems. God doesn't always do things the way we expect Him to do things. Have you noticed that? When you read the Old Testament, it becomes even more startling to you than it is when you think in terms of the New Testament. But here are these boys, and God sends the bears out, and the bears tie into 42 of those kids. And it sounds like a gory, bloody, useless story. Why is it there? What is God trying to prove with it? What's the purpose of putting it in the Word of God? Well, I hope when we're done this morning you'll have a little better grasp of why such a story might be there and what kinds of things we might be able to learn from it. Let's read it first, please, in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23. He went up from there, that is, he left Jericho. He was on his way to Bethel. And he was going up, as he was going along the path, some young lads came out of the city, and they mocked him and said to him, "Go up, Baldy. Get going, Baldy." When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. A little while later, then, 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. And he kept on going from there to Mount Carmel, and then he returned to Samaria. Now let's get a little historical perspective and a little bit of the idea of what's happening. First of all, he's on his way to Bethel. What do you know about Bethel? What kind of a place was this? Do you remember the story of Jacob's dream when the ladder reached up to heaven and God reconfirmed the promise to Jacob that He had made to Abraham and to Isaac? Where did that occur? It was renamed Beit El by Jacob, Bethel. Beit El means the house of God. So we know that this was a place where some unusual occurrences happened. Another thing that you will notice very early on is that when the prophets began to develop their schools, they called them schools of the prophets. Maybe we ought to say seminaries today. Bethel, was one of the places that was picked for a school of the prophets. There was a goodly sized number of students at that school. When the two kingdoms split, when the northern tribes severed from the southern two tribes, after he had the whole split accomplished, Jeroboam said, "If I don't do something now about the situation, what I am going to find out is that sooner or later, because the temple is down in Jerusalem and the people have to journey down there continuously to worship, people are going to turn away and they're going to go back down there to Judah and accept the king of Judah as their king instead of my line." So he said, "I will not rule out Israel's God as such, but I will establish a new form of worship." And he made some golden calves, or some calves. He put one of them at Dan and one of them where? Bethel. Okay? There was a place of worship there. That's found in 1 Kings 12:29. So where God does something, Satan begins to do something too, doesn't he? First principle, Bethel. In the house of God is where Satan chose to erect an idolatrous place through Jeroboam. Where the house of God is, the house of Satan is going to try to work. Next thing is that they mocked him. If you read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 36, you will find an indictment of the people of Israel. They were constantly mocking their prophets, constantly putting them to death. It amazes me sometimes as I read the story of Jeremiah, and you'll find it also in the story of Micaiah, that these prophets were known to not say things the kings liked. So sometimes other prophets would come to them when they had a message from the king, "Come and see me, I want to ask you a question." They'd coach them on the way And they'd say things like, now all the rest of the prophets have said it like this. When you get there, you tell it like this, and then you won't have any problems, Jeremiah or Micaiah. You won't have any problems if you just tell it like the rest of us did. So those two men who were outstandingly known for that went into the presence of the king, and they told him exactly what these other fellows coached them to say. And the king promptly looked at them and said, this is the first time you ever agreed with those other guys. Something's wrong. Now tell me the truth. So they told him the truth. And then he put them in jail. They did not treat their prophets very nicely. If you look at their history, they were pretty rough on them. If you think about the three people that led Israel out of Egypt, one was Moses, one was Aaron, and one was Miriam. They're brothers and sister. They had started along the journey a ways, and in Numbers chapter 12, Aaron and Miriam decided Moses was taking too much authority in his hands. So they came to him and they said, hey, we can't have this. This is no one-man show. I mean, after all, you told God you couldn't speak, and God gave you Aaron, and neither one of you could carry on if I wasn't here to take care of you. So we ought to have equal say in things. You know what happened to them? One was forbidden entrance to the promised land, and the other one became a leper. Why did God do that? They were busy mocking that leadership. The people of Israel came to Moses and they said, Moses, you're a phony. You brought us out of the land of Egypt and you promised us something and it hasn't happened. And now we got this problem with these giants and these big walls and these iron weapons and there's no way out of the situation. Why did you do that to us? Why didn't you just leave us down in Egypt? And a whole generation died in the wilderness. And then again, some came to Moses, led by two men by the name of Nadab and Abihu. And they said, Moses, we have as much authority as you have. And that was where Aaron's rod budded and those men died. Why did God do things like that? You see, God picked an Elisha, and he picked a Moses, and he picked a Peter, and he picked some of these others. And when God puts them into that place and picks them like that, God becomes identified with them. Do you remember the story of the conversion of Paul? He was still called Saul. He was on his way to Damascus when he was stopped by a light from the heaven. And the voice from heaven said, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou, what's the next word? Me. Who was Saul persecuting? See? The Lord says, why are you persecuting me? But actually, the people that he was the ones that were feeling the brunt of his persecution were the believers, the apostles and their followers down on the face of the earth. God said, if you touch one of mine, you are touching me. You see? Same principle here. When they started mocking Elisha, they were mocking the man on whom Elijah's mantle had fallen. They were mocking the man that God had said previously to Elijah, I have a successor for you. His name is Elisha. They weren't just mocking this man. What they were doing is mocking what God had said was going to happen next. They are mocking God. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 4, Ananias and Sapphira bring their gift into the apostles, and they lay it down at their feet. And the apostles say to them, is this all of it? And they, with a smile on their face, say, yes, that's every penny. And then Peter looks at them one at a time, because they came in separately, and he says, why have you chosen to lie to the Spirit of God? Now, to whom did they lie? They lied to Peter. But you see, Peter was indwelt by the Spirit of God. So they were lying to the Spirit of God. When you begin to understand that, you understand that on his way to the house of God is the man of God, and now they're going to make fun of the whole process. They're not just laughing at Elisha. They're laughing at a whole history. They're laughing at the dealings of God with Israel. They're laughing at the God of Israel. Verse 23, some lads came out. Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of this word, these children. You know, doesn't King James say children? I don't know why they translated it children. The Hebrews have a word for children, toddlers, little kids. That's not the word. The word here, na'arim, is a word for young men. They were teenagers. They were in their teens and 20s. They were not toddlers. They weren't 4 years old and 6 years old and 8 years old. They were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. It's the same word that gets used for a servant. Remember in Galatians, Paul says that the heir is no different from a servant until the time of adoption. They were in this category of of in between. They weren't inheritors yet. Their dads were still alive. They weren't running the family, but they're old enough to have arrived at that kind of a place. They're sort of in between. Now, I want you to think of how you would feel if you were walking along very calmly. Let's see, where can I have you walking? You've left the Twin Cities, and you're headed towards Faribault, and you're about 2/3 of the way out there, and you're walking. All right? You're all by yourself now, and suddenly you hear behind you this commotion, and you turn around, you see more than 50 teenagers laughing at you, causing all kinds of uproar. How would you feel if you turned around in those circumstances in the quiet countryside, and there are more than 50 of these older teenagers? I know how I'd get. I think I'd get a little nervous. Wouldn't you? What are they doing out here? Why were they there? What's going on? Now you see, it wasn't just a little thing, because the way the grammar reads in verse 24, Elisha keeps on going. He doesn't stop. He doesn't turn around and fight with them. He just keeps on going, and they keep it up, which means that if he's going in the direction, what are they doing? They're following along. They didn't just come out and laugh a little bit and poke a little fun and then let it go. They kept after him and after him and after him. What did Elisha do? If he had been David, he probably would have picked up 5 smooth stones and a sling and let him have it, right? He wasn't. If he was Samson, he'd have plucked up a tree and knocked him over. But he wasn't a Samson. And he wasn't a David. He's Elisha. He's not a strong man like Joab, who would have taken a sword and just waded in and taken care of the situation. Not Elisha. You know what Elisha did? All he did was turn around and say, "You are doing wrong, and God is going to judge you for it." And then he turned back and started walking. That's all he did. Elisha didn't say, "God, send 2 bears." Did he? It just says he turned around and he cursed them. Now that word curse is very common in the Old Testament. He just simply turned around and said, "You are doing wrong, and the judgment of God will be on your head for it." That's all he said. And then he went away, kept on going. Now after that, the bears came. Who brought the bears? God sent the bears? I mean, you stop and think about that for a minute. 2 bears come out of the woods. Who sent them? Oh, and by the way, read the text carefully. It says the bears went after them and mauled 42 of their number. Now, if he mauled 42 of the number, how many kids must there have been? Had to be more than 42, right? Maybe 43? Maybe 45? Maybe 50? This was not just a small, it wasn't even a spontaneous group, if you get the feel of the passage. You see, Elisha is coming up to Bethel to take over the position of Elijah, right? What's at Bethel? A school of the prophets with a chief prophet, huh? A new prophet's coming up the road to take over. How's this chief prophet up here feel? A little bit threatened. So what does he do? He organizes a spontaneous demonstration. We should be familiar with spontaneous demonstrations in our country. We had a lot of them on campuses during the 1960s. In fact, one popular magazine had pictures of the same men present at about 9 campuses within 3 months' time. He wasn't a student at any of them, but he's right in the front fomenting things, getting them going. That's the kind of situation you have here, you see. It's just not that simple. It isn't just a little bunch of little kids that came out on their tricycles and rooted out on the road and waved their hands and stuck their tongue out. This is an organized group of young adults out to demonstrate that this new prophet has no business coming to our city. Our prophet school will take care of things. How do we know anything about this man after all? Maybe it was just simply a matter of testing. If you look at the schools of the prophets in the Word of God, very, very often when God's prophet said this and one of the others said that, one of them would say like he did to Micaiah. He said, "When did the Spirit of God pass from me to you?" As if to say, now, what kind of authority have you got to take away my... I've been here, I've had the king's ear all this time. Now you come in here and you think you can just walk in? What makes you think God is going to cause you to have this privilege or this right? Can you picture what's happening? It's not a simple little thing. It's not just a man walking along the road and people making fun of him. It's a whole ball game of authority and position and God's dealing and who's in charge, and that whole thing is flowing through this particular picture. Now, I wondered why I liked the story of Elisha so well, but when I read this I understood, and they started laughing at him, called him Baldy. I could identify with Elisha and understand some of the problems perhaps that he had. But I want you to think about this for a moment. In Leviticus 21:5, one of the things that was forbidden to the priesthood and the spiritual leaders of the people of Israel was to shave their heads. The priests could not minister with shaved heads. Think of what you think about when you think of a Tibetan priest. What does his head look like? How many of these heathen cults require that the head be completely shaved, clear? Sometimes it's painted with designs and symbolism, but always shaved clear. God said, you're not going to do that and walk into my temple. Think of the vow of the Nazarite. The man had to let his hair grow unshaved. One of the problems that a bald man had back in those days was that if he got blisters on his head, and there was any possibility of there being leprosy, it was so easy to make the inspection. See? And so they're warned about in that category. This is not just a little thing with these people. What these young men are saying is, that guy isn't of God. He's unclean. He's not fit to lead. He doesn't belong in the prophet's role. And that's what they're saying. And he turns around as a prophet and simply says, all right, God, if I'm your prophet, you show him. That's what it's about. It's about God's man coming in and doing the thing that God wanted done at this particular point in time. Why 42? Well, if you stop and think about the tribulation period, it's divided into two halves, isn't it? 2 periods of months. How long was each of those periods? 42. 42 is one of those judgment numbers in the Old Testament. There were more boys there. Now picture the boys with the bears. Suppose the bears came out of the woods and all this mob of young teenagers is there. How do you think they would have reacted to the bears? What do you think they'd be doing? We were in Yellowstone a couple of years ago, and you know what you like to see when you're in Yellowstone? Everybody goes to Yellowstone. They want to see the bears. First time I was ever in Yellowstone, I saw people roll the windows down and stick pieces of bread out for the bears. Sometimes they'd be right next to the sign that said, don't feed the bears, they're wild animals. They'd do it anyway. The last time we were in Yellowstone, we had driven almost all of the roadways of the park, and we had not seen one bear. It was disappointing. And as we were getting ready to take the main road to come back towards Minneapolis, we saw a bear. I mean, a live bear up there on the side of the hill. We stopped the car, and guess what the kids did? They took the camera to get a picture of the bear. Where did they stand? Right close to the car. No, the bear started to move. It was attracting attention. The bear started to move, and the kids started to move, and it wasn't just kids, because there were people from other cars, and they got out, and they got off the side of the road, and they started climbing up the side of the hill, chasing the bear. Now, one of the principles with a wild animal is you can chase them a little ways, but if you chase them too far, the chase reverses. And the bear decides to be the aggressor. And then things happen. Picture 50 kids already riled up, already calling names, and they see these 2 she-bears come out of the woods. Now, why does it stipulate she-bears? Because the most ferocious of all bears is a mother bear when she is protecting her cubs. They saw this. What do these kids do? Oh, we'll leave Baldy for a few minutes. We'll take care of those bears over there. We'll show the bears who's boss. It doesn't say they killed them. It doesn't say the bears killed the boys, does it? Read the text. Suppose there are 2 bears and 50 of these kids throwing stones, making noises, charging in and out. What's going to happen? Is the bear going to have time enough with any one of them to finish the job, or is he swatting out in every direction, sending the kids rolling, hurting them, injuring them? It doesn't say they're dead. That's just an assumption that we make going into the text, isn't it? Wild bear gets a hold of somebody, he's dead. What do you think of when you think of a shark bite? You think that's it, person dies. They don't all die. There are a lot of people alive that have been bitten by sharks swimming in the ocean. It does not say in the text they're dead. It says the bears mauled them. But if you get the whole picture of this thing, I really think that the boys started out teasing the bears, which is a very, incidentally, they are boys. The word na'arim is masculine. It's not boys and girls. These are all young men. And when you get 50 young men all excited in a mob, and you got 2 bears there, can you picture the fun those kids think they're going to have? I've seen it with less than 40. I've seen it with 3 who decided to chase a bear. And the bear decided he was tired of the chase, going that direction, came this direction. And the boys turned around too. I remember that very vividly, because I remember when Ebert stood up in the boat and scared the bear back. Think about it now. Think about this whole flow of things. Where does Elisha go then? He goes on to Mount Carmel. You know what Mount Carmel was? Mount Carmel is a ridge. Haifa, modern Haifa, is built on Mount Carmel. It is on the sea side of Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is where Elijah had the contest with the priests of Baal. Mount Carmel has a series of caves on it. It was like a retreat house. When the priests or the prophets wanted to be alone, when they wanted to go and spend time with God off by themselves, where did they go? To Mount Carmel. Elisha continues on his way and goes to Mount Carmel, where he can be alone with God. He does not stay in this location. Now, let's think about this for a moment and make a few quick extensions from it. If you look through the Word of God, you will find that it has always been dangerous to mock God's pictures and God's people. When other nations came down on the people of Israel, even if God used them in judgment, what happened to them after that? They always... Do you remember the story of the Egyptian Pharaoh that got drowned in the Red Sea? There's a gap in Egyptian history about that time where there was no power. There was a vacuum in Egypt for hundreds of years before Egypt collected itself back together again and got itself reorganized. They lost their Pharaoh, and they lost their next Pharaoh in the plague. There was no leadership. They had to vie house with house in order to take over that leadership position again. There was a vacuum, a problem. Think about Moses. Moses went to that rock. The second time God said, "Speak to the rock." Moses didn't speak. Moses did what? He struck the rock. And God said, "All right, Moses, now you can't go in the promised land." Moses killed the Egyptian and God didn't stop him. Moses didn't circumcise his sons and God didn't stop him. Moses did a lot of other things but he hit that rock the second time and God said, "That's it, Moses, now you don't go in the promised land." You'd never understand that if Paul hadn't written 1 Corinthians, where it says, the rock that followed them was Christ, who was to be smitten how many times? Once. What had Moses just done? He struck the rock for the second time and destroyed one of God's pictures of his son. And God said, "Out. You're not going in the promised land." The Titus passage, one in Timothy, one in Philippians, all lean in that same direction. God has something that he does with his people, with his leaders, with his people. He protects them. Mob scenes are not that place of protection. Mobs don't act properly. These 50 young people, and notice I'm using the number 50 because I think it's probably more than that. If I really had a guess, I'd say there were probably 75 to 100 of them. The bears got 42. So there were a lot of these, whoever they were. It's just a guess. Mobs don't act properly. Think through the Word of God. Every time you see a mob, what are they doing? There was a mob at Ephesus wanting to put Paul to death. There was a mob here doing something to Elisha. Every time you run into that, you find the mob out of order. You find things not as they ought to be. It's hard for us to realize how many mob scenes we have had in the history of the United States. The first one, we almost eulogize. You know what the first mob scene was? It was called the Boston Tea Party. Now, I'm with the colonialists. How about you? I'm glad we got our independence. But if you were the owner of that ship, and you were the owner of that tea, you weren't the British government either, were you? Somebody owned it. How would you feel about them coming in and dumping your tea into the bay? Would you have been happy about it? Would you have thought it was worthwhile? See? We've gone through all kinds of them, down to the Watts riots. when on television they had pictures of people with coaster wagons and wheelbarrows hauling things away from stores that they had picked out during the riots, and they'd take their picture. One outstanding one, they took a picture of the fellow and he said, "Where'd you get it?" And on television, national TV, the fellow says, "I took it out of that store over there." Well, first question is, "It's mine." He said, "Whose is it?" "It's mine." "Where'd you get it from?" "I took it out of that store over there." "You mean you just took it?" "Yeah." "You didn't pay for it?" "No, I took it." "Why is it yours?" He said, "Because everybody else has got one and I don't. This one's mine." Now that was the sum gist of the conversation. They picked the fellow up to prosecute him. And they were going to try him, and they brought the TV tape in, and the court said, "Sorry, you can't use it as evidence because it was taken without his permission." And so the fellow walked out of the court. It was the only final evidence they had, the only way of proving everything. The fellow walked away. Mob scenes. We've had a lot of them. Here's one. Elisha acted properly. He threw no stones. He raised no stick. Elisha simply turned around and said, "You kids are out of order, and God is going to take care of it. He'll judge you for it." Now you think there's something bad about Elisha's answer? I don't. But he got shook. And with all of this going on, he felt a need for retreat. So he didn't stay at Bethel. He went on to Mount Carmel, to the retreat house for prophets, to spend time with God. Because I think Elisha was a caring man, and that probably shook him up too, with this whole thing going on. The interesting thing was he had just finished doing something good. He had just finished cleaning up that spring at Jericho, a spring that has run clear ever since. He's on his way to Bethel. Everything looks like it's on the upswing. You would have thought that they'd have been waiting for him at Bethel with a whole list of projects for him to take care of. You know, our cistern leaks. This happens, that happens. Nope. They're threatened by his coming. So instead, they start shouting names, and they send these kids out to do this kind of thing. Do you remember when the Lord cast out the demon from a man? The leaders of the people of Israel came and said, "He does it by the power of Beelzebub, Satan." Why? Because they couldn't do the same thing. What a sad story. Here are some practical lessons from our story, from Elisha. Many, many times when we have a victory in our lives, what comes next? You ever notice that? Something happens and you're flying high spiritually and everything seems to be good, and then all of a sudden it seems like the bottom drops out, doesn't it? Why does that happen? Does God want to keep Elisha reminded he's not just a spring cleaner? Does God want to keep Elisha reminded who God is? But so oftentimes from a high we go to a low, and that's exactly what happens. When we come down to that low, what do we need? Spend time with the Lord. What did Elisha do? He went to Carmel to spend time with the Lord, you see. God protects his people. Elisha didn't bring the bears out. God did. God takes care of his people. The people of Israel are a living testimony to the fact that God takes care of his people, aren't they? Read history. The Holocaust was a terrible time, but it wasn't the only time. It wasn't the only time of persecution. It still goes on today. Still goes on with Christians in some lands where the gospel is forbidden. Another lesson is that mob scenes don't accomplish God's work. They never have, and they never will. And judging or ridiculing God's people is doing it to God. There are some lessons in this little story. This man was going about God's business, and these people were not paying attention. God caught their attention. There are some practical lessons. Oh, this is not the dispensation of law. This is the dispensation of grace. But does God care less about his people today? Does God care less about his people today than he cared back then? Does God want less of his work accomplished? Does God have less hand in things today than he did back then? It's a story about Elisha. He's challenged by the pack, and God brings victory. How would you have reacted if you were Elisha? I don't know how I would have reacted. I think just the size, the number of those kids would have been a pretty frightening, awesome thing to me. Elisha's not just being poked at as an individual. It's his position, his office, his relationship to God. Think about what's happening in this story. And think about how God took care of his people and how he still takes care of his people. And then realize this is our God. This is the God with whom we deal. He loves us, you, me, just like he loved Elisha. It seemed like everything was against him. 42 plus to 1. Those are not good odds. But God evened the odds out, didn't he? Now, maybe the human reaction for Elisha would have been to be like a Samson or a Samuel. I think if Samson had been there, he'd have picked up the jawbone of an ass or a piece of tree or something like that and waded right into the crowd, don't you? I think he'd have done that. But Samson was always impetuously doing things. Elisha didn't. He said, Lord, it's your problem. Take care of it. And God did. Can God still do it? Sure. Is God still on the throne? Yes. Does God still care for his own? Yes. Elisha, starting out, came from a victory to a low point to a retreat to be with God. If we learn anything practical from that, we learn that when we are high, Satan is going to do something, isn't he, to try and tear us down. And when you get torn down, you know what you need? God. You don't need busy Bethel. You need quiet Carmel. You don't need activity. You need retreat, time. Think about the lessons that can be learned from Baldy and the two bears.